Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Conference of the Trees at the New York Times Climate Hub. We are in for a treat, I think a very interesting conversation now. Somini Sengupta, our international climate reporter, is going to be in conversation with Vanessa Nakate and Yuval Noah Harari. This session is going to explore the climate crisis from a wider historical context and tackle or wrestle with the crucial questions of surrounding global inequality. By the way, I know that Vanessa has been on this stage earlier this week. I understand that her book in the Conduit bookstore is the fastest selling book. So if you want to get one, you should go there quite quickly after this session. But with that, please give a very round welcome to, and round of applause and welcome to Somini Sengupta and Vanessa Nakate. And Yuval will appear on stage.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We welcome you to the New York Times Climate Hub. Hi, Yuval. On the screen, I know that the audience can see you here, and I can see you in front. This is a panel about history. Yuval Harari, you're a student of history. You're a historian. Your writing draws on broad sweeps of time, from prehistory to the modern day. You are 45 years old, and you are the author of several books, including most recently 21 Ideas for the 21st Century. Vanessa Nakate, you are part of a movement making history. You are part of Fridays for the Future in Uganda. You are 24 years old and the author of the book that Stephen just mentioned, published in November, called A Bigger Picture. Welcome, big welcome to both of you. Yuval, let me start with you first. You've said that a powerful story that young people are telling is the following. They're telling the older generation that, quote, this is your words, "You're sacrificing us on the altar of your greed and irresponsibility." I wonder if there has been another moment in history or another movement where this storyline has been effective or even has been used to push for change.
I mean, it's a well-known story. This is why it's effective. I mean, part of the problem of the climate movement earlier was that it didn't have a powerful enough story. Climate change is too nebulous. If you think about it like a Hollywood blockbuster, so people would go to see a disaster movie with a title like Tornado or Volcano or Invasion of the Giant Ants. But almost nobody would go to see a movie whose title is 2 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial levels. It wasn't a clear and powerful enough story. And then the new activists, the young generation, came up with a very old story, a very old trope, going back to Abraham and Isaac or Agamemnon and Iphigenia, of the old sacrificing the young. And this resonated far more powerfully. People could connect to it, could understand immediately what is at stake. And we need such powerful stories in order to change history. Yeah.
You know, there's also been another storyline all this time. And in some ways, it's also a very old storyline, which is that rich countries have sacrificed the well-being of poor countries for 150 years. And in that period, of course, has also come not just industrialization, but colonialism. And of course, before that, the slave trade. So I wonder if, Vanessa, in your movement, is there a moment in history that you look back to? Another movement that either you see as a template or you draw inspiration from?
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the movements that I really grow and get inspiration from is the Green Belt movement, which was founded by Wangari Maathai. And Wangari Maathai is someone very special to me, but someone I got to know and learn about so recently, not like in school. And I wish that she was someone that we were learning about in school, about her movement which focused on, planting of trees, environmental conservation, women's rights. And from some of the things that I have learned from Wangari Maathai, that is where I've learned some of the connections of the climate crisis and other issues like the climate crisis and women's rights or girls' rights, the climate crisis and eradication of poverty, and how all these things are interconnected. So I would say that Wangari Maathai and the Green Belt movement has been a very powerful inspiration for me and the work that we've done in Uganda.
And I want you to feel free, Yuval and Vanessa, to respond to what you're hearing the other person say. Indeed, I think it would be extremely valuable if students all over the world were to learn more about Wangari Maathai's work, her commitment. Vanessa, for you now first, we are at this really critical juncture in the COP26 summit that's going on down the road over there. This is sort of the sprint. The last 3 days of negotiations are underway. Where are we now, in your view? The climate tracker report that came out earlier this week that you in the audience will be familiar with said that the world is on track to warm by 2.4 degrees. And that is the story that climate scientists have been, after all, trying to tell, that it's urgent to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So, Vanessa, how will history judge this summit if the countries of the world, particularly the big polluter countries, cannot limit temperature rise to 1.5?
Yeah, the first thing I would like to say is that 2.4 degrees is a death sentence for very many communities. As we have been advocating and talking about limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, it's important for people to know that even at 1.2 degrees, it has been hell for so many communities in my country.
That's where we are now.
Exactly.
We are about at 1.2 degrees, yeah.
Across the African continent, the climate crisis has been ravaging vast parts of the African continent. Many people have lost their farms, many people are losing their businesses, many people have lost their lives. So this is what is happening at 1.2. The weather patterns are changing, they're being disrupted. We are seeing more extreme weather events across the African continent. And this is one of the disconnections that I have been talking about. What we think that 1.5 is our salvation, and yet still at 1.5, it won't be safe for very many communities. But if we are on a pathway to 2.4, that is a death sentence for millions of people across the world.
Yuval, do you have an assessment of where we are at now and how history will judge this summit?
Well, it depends on what we do, of course. First, I would like to thank Vanessa for mentioning the Green Belt movement. I haven't heard of it, and I'll definitely look it up now. And as for how history will judge us and this particular moment, it depends on what we decide. And I think it's very important to emphasize we still have agency, we still have power. Some people have swung too quickly from denial to pessimism and like it's too late, we can't do anything. So in addition to the emphasis on 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we should also emphasize other numbers like 2%. 2% according to several estimates in order to prevent catastrophic climate change of the kind that Vanessa talked about, the price tag is just 2% of annual global GDP. If we invest just 2% of global GDP in developing the right technologies and infrastructures, this is enough to prevent catastrophic climate change. Now that's a lot of money, 2% of annual global GDP, it's $1.7 trillion. But we spend on our militaries, governments spend on their militaries more than that. They spend $2 trillion every year. We spend on food, which is wasted, about the same amount of money every year. And tax evasion by corporations and billionaires account for about 10% of global GDP. So, you know, we don't need more taxes. We just need to collect the old taxes, the existing taxes, and there is enough money in the world, if it is invested in the right places, to prevent the catastrophe. If we don't do it, future generations, if they exist, will blame us, and rightly.
You know, the 2% of GDP argument that you make is interesting. There's also the question of who pays. And I think, Vanessa, your argument has been some of the most vulnerable people in the world have already been paying for a problem that they did not create. But here in the summit, there's also a very robust, very pointed debate about who pays going forward. And one of the points of contention is over something called loss and damage. The idea is the countries of the rich world should pay those in the global south who have had very little to do with this problem but are suffering its consequences. Some people call it reparations, but in the official climate talks, it's called loss and damage. What message would it send if this summit ends without financing for loss and damage?
Firstly, I want to say that we know who caused the climate crisis, and we know exactly who needs to pay for that. Historically, the continent of Africa is responsible for only 3% of global emissions, and yet, like I've said, many Africans are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And this is the horrible reality of this crisis. The communities, the people who are suffering some of the most brutal impacts of climate change have no idea about what global warming really is. They have no idea about the industries that are continuously fueling the climate crisis. And loss and damage is something that is already happening in these communities. You know, these communities cannot adapt, you know, if their identities are lost. They cannot adapt to lost identities or to their lost cultures or to their lost lands or even to their lost homes, places they call home. They cannot adapt to that. If I lose my home or if I lose, you know, my farm and then you hand me another farm or another home, it won't be the same. There is a difference because I have a connection to the place where I grew from. So as loss and damage continues, you know, to happen across different parts of the world, communities are losing their traditions, their cultures, their identities. Many children are starving. Many species are facing extinction as the climate crisis escalates. We are losing biodiversity. We are losing ecosystems. This is what loss and damage is doing right now. And that's why we need a fund. We need finance for loss and damage. We need leaders to acknowledge that loss and damage is here with us now to provide finance for loss and damage for communities on the front lines. We are still waiting for the $100 billion climate finance that was promised, and that is the bare minimum, but it has not yet been delivered. It has been delayed to 2022. So we have to, communities on the front line still have to wait, for 2022 to see the deliverance or implementation of the $100 billion climate finance. So if there is no funds or if there is no deliverance of climate finance for communities on the front lines, it is completely unfair to our communities that didn't cause the climate crisis, and it's going to push more communities into extreme suffering, extreme starvation, extreme loss of lives, and extreme loss and damage. Because any more delays, there is something I said at an action that we were doing, and it was a delay here and a delay there, a broken promise here and a broken promise there, a commitment here and a commitment there, and then leaders just sit back. What do you expect? Loss and damage. So the more we see more promises being broken, the more we see these delays of climate finance, it means loss and damage for our communities.
So the $100 billion that you're referring to, of course, is money that was promised over a decade ago. That $100 billion was supposed to materialize by 2020. The full amount is still not on the table, and the expectation now is that it may be on the table by next year, or maybe the year after.
Pardon?
Or maybe the year after.
Yeah.
Given this, and given what you've said about both the sort of tangible GDP losses and the intangible losses of culture, of identity, of nature, right, which we haven't quite put a price tag on. Given all of that, where does your movement go from here? Where does your movement go on Saturday when, in principle, the summit ends?
We continue to strike, we continue to organize, we continue to mobilize, because we cannot give up right now. We cannot give up everything that we have done until now. So the movement continues to speak up, to strike, to organize, to mobilize, and to demand for climate justice. Because if we stop, then the situation could get much worse. So we don't give up.
I'm curious, do your tactics change? Does your message change in any way, given what you're seeing here?
I don't think the message changes because it's still the same climate crisis. And if we are demanding for climate justice, it is the same thing that we are asking for. It is the same thing generations before us who are organizing and mobilizing as well. It has always been the same thing. Maybe tactics have changed, but the message stays the same. We want a future, but now we want a present and future because the present itself is already catastrophic. So we want a present and a future that is sustainable, that is healthy, that is clean and equitable for all of us. So the message remains the same, rising up for the people and for the planet.
Yuval, can I ask you to reflect on history that hasn't yet been written? You know, we now study the story of other kind of big global crises on which people did not agree, on which world leaders didn't necessarily agree, right? Whether that was the rise of fascism or colonialism or the equality of gender equity. So when the history of the climate movement is written, what do you think should be remembered? How should we think of this moment in history? Perhaps that's another way of asking.
Well, again, it depends on the decisions that are taken. And nothing is deterministic. That, you know, you just mentioned the $100 billion that are still not being delivered to these fragile communities facing so many difficulties. I mean, the money is basically there. I mean, every year, roughly $500 billion is paid in subsidies to the fossil fuel industries, which is, you know, it's amazing. Every year, governments write a check of $500 billion and give it as a present to the fossil fuel industries. And they don't have $100 billion to give to the communities that are suffering. The war in Afghanistan cost $2 trillion. So there is money. The question is always the choices that people make, politicians, also ordinary voters, about what do you choose to do. And we need, you know, to shift priorities, but this is what we've always been doing in politics. Politics is exactly about shifting, you know, a couple of percentages in the budget from here to there. You know, if we needed 50% of global GDP to solve this, then, you know, this is impossible. You can't do it. But we are talking about a few percentages. That's it. So it's completely feasible. It will demand a big change in mindset, but this is also possible. You know, when people look back at history, they sometimes think that in order to make big revolutions, social, cultural, political, you need a lot of violence. You need to shake things up with violence. There is this saying that to make an omelette, you need to break eggs. But this is not true. If you look at the feminist revolution, it's been one of the biggest social revolutions ever, shaking the foundations of society, and it was completely peaceful. They didn't start wars, they didn't build concentration camps, they didn't assassinate any leaders, and yet they changed the world, and quite quickly. So I think this is inspiration that we can do it again on the ecological front. Whether we'll do it or not, I don't know. I look around and things are not looking promising. But the power to do it is still there. We shouldn't fall into the pessimistic way of thinking that it's too late. It's now coming the end of the world or something like that.
Well, I was going to ask you both that because many of us get asked this question when we speak about climate change. Are we doomed? I'm sure you get that question quite often. Yuval, you want to take that first? Are we doomed?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, again, it's up to us. We are extremely powerful. We are the most powerful thing this planet has ever seen. We caused this problem, but we also have the power to solve it, and in the process, not just to solve the ecological problem, but also to create a more just and happier society that lives, you know, in communion and in harmony, on greater harmony with nature, not in opposition to it. Every moment of our life, we breathe in and breathe out. We are basically part of the climate. We are part of the atmosphere. It's not something out there. And we can create a better world. It's not impossible. It's a question of politics.
Vanessa, are we doomed? I was very struck by the speech you gave on Saturday at the climate protests here, at which you spoke squarely to that.
It depends, because we may be facing the same storm, but we are in different boats. What I mean, the communities who may be in boats that are much weaker. There are communities which may be in boats that are already sinking or boats that are already on fire. And there are also communities that are in way stronger boats and can still withstand, while other communities are put to nothing. So the question of doom, it really depends, because there are communities that are being destroyed right now because of the climate crisis. We are not going to reach a specific point whereby it's going to be a whole sweeping away of the whole world for us to say that we are finally doomed. And I think, you know, when people ask the question of doom, I think some people ask it from a place of privilege because they haven't seen, they still feel like we have more time to protect the planet, to stop the warming of the planet. But I can say for communities that are losing schools or losing farms or losing homes or losing businesses, or where people are dying, or where girls are dropping out of school, girls are being forced into early marriages, that is not good at all. So we may be facing the same storm, but we are in different boats. And that is the horrible reality of the climate crisis.
I'm struck by how on that very simple question, Yuval, you emphasized your answer was about whether we are doomed, and you said nothing is predetermined. Vanessa, your emphasis was on the we. Which we are we talking about?
The we are talking about, when you ask, are we doomed, do you mean all of us?
No, your answer was very clear that the we, there's very different.
There are different we's.
Yeah, there are different we's.
Yeah.
Your answer was very clear on that. So my last question really is, how do you want this movement to be remembered in history?
I think that the movement is already being seen as one that is fighting for the protection of people, the protection of people's rights, and the protection of the ecosystems and the environment in general. So I think that for the movement, history has already been written. Young people have organized and mobilized to demand for a future that is healthy for all of us. And I feel like young people or activists have really done enough, you know? And I think that there is no specific thing that we have to do to be remembered in history. Young people have done enough in organizing and mobilizing and striking or protesting. So I think let us look at what is happening right now, and that is people fighting for the protection of the planet and also the protection of people's lives.
Yuval, can I ask you one last one about what is the measure of success? Is it to reach the 1.5 target? Is it something else? How do we know that this movement and the effort to address climate change is working?
Well, I completely agree with Vanessa here that it's a question of the most vulnerable people, and not just people, also of the most vulnerable animals, of the most vulnerable habitats and parts of the ecosystem. What is their fate? I also agree that there is no single we. You know, some people compare it to another biblical story, the story of the flood. And there is a very sinister message there, that there is a danger that some people, the usual suspects, will save themselves from whatever happens using a new ark, a technological Noah's Ark, that will allow them to survive the flood, whereas many people, maybe most people, most animals, most habitats will be destroyed. So we need to measure our success not by some abstract number like 1.5%, and not by the survival of, the richest people or the most developed countries, but by what happens to the most vulnerable members of the ecological system. Again, whether humans or non-humans.
I think it's, and I'm sorry you're not here, Yuval, but this is an exceptional space with which to consider that and really end on that note, because we are surrounded by trees here in the Conference of Trees who don't exactly have a voice, but who we might want to just take a moment and listen to. So I thank you, Yuval Harari, for joining us from Tel Aviv. I thank you, Vanessa Nakate, for joining us here. And I thank our audience here and everywhere else.